Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joined this event. My name is Tom Butler. I'm the CEO of ICMM. Thank you to all of you for joining our online panel discussion today. And thank you also to our panelists. I'm delighted to welcome Anglo American CEO Kutifani, Minsure CEO Juan Luis Kruger, and the Minerals Council of Australia CEO Tanya Constable. Today, we're going to hear their thoughts on what they have learned from the COVID-19 crisis and what they think the future holds. We have in total 45 minutes for this session, but we'll make sure to leave time following the panel discussion to take one or two questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question as we go through the discussion, please enter it into the question and answer subject box, not the chat function, but the question and answer subject box, and make sure that the all panelists option is selected when you send your question. So I'm going to jump straight into the discussion, and I'm going to start off by asking Mark, what do you think you have learned so far from this crisis, and what has the industry learned so far?
Thanks, Tom. I think the most important thing I've learned personally from the crisis is probably how much people don't appreciate how we operate in our communities and what we provide, and how a number of things in the communities are connected. When the crisis first touched everyone, there was an immediate reaction to close everything. And it was interesting in that first week when we engaged with governments, politicians and local communities, and in many cases we provide water, we provide energy, we do a lot of infrastructure work around those communities, and in some cases we provide food and other services. And what we said is, if you shut these functions down, the community will actually literally run out of food within a matter of 1 or 2 weeks. So essential services aren't simply keeping the lights on or providing water, which we do in many of our communities, but it's much broader. And keeping the supply chains moving is absolutely critical to making sure society functions. And so the first thing that was really important to us, even after the first week, is we mapped out all of our community supply chains and essential services and came up with a strategy with our local communities to keep all of these functions operating. Now, I've been told that we've been criticised for actually continuing operations. In most cases, we're at a much smaller rate. We were the first groups, or one of the first groups, to implement social distancing, sanitisation process, and a whole range of other things. We also took those into the communities and then worked out with our local communities how we keep water flowing, how we keep the lights on. In many cases, and we've actually delivered thousands of food parcels because people actually literally ran out of food in lockdown, and went through a whole range of basic infrastructure and services that we provide. And in many cases, even our own employees hadn't recognised how much we do in those local communities. So ultimately, we were able to work our way back up through local communities and governments, regional communities, and to the federal government, and said, your definition of essential services has to be extended because we're literally going to run out of food within 2 weeks if we don't keep essential services going to farmers. That's chemicals and a whole range of things. We don't keep the food moving. We don't keep the shops full. We've got to keep supply chains full. Transnet in South Africa, for example, would run out of money if we weren't moving some of our products so that they could then keep the other supply chains moving because other people didn't have the money to actually pay them. So we help people understand how society works, and we still see today people haven't really connected all the dots. So that was the biggest issue. And the second part of that is how we can do things differently and impact on how all those pieces connect. And so that became our real focus in the operation, is how do we, one, keep people safe in our own operations. And even though we are operating at not a full capacity, but we're operating at about 70% complement so that we've got all of our social distancing in place, but we've taken all of our sanitary protocols, all of the processes we've developed. We've now got 45 PCR testing units across the globe, 50% are in the operations, 50% are in our local communities. Our screening practices, all of the tools they need. We've opened hospitals, we're staffing hospitals, we've got ventilators in the hospitals. Helping connect all those dots has been the biggest learning for us, and certainly the most constructive and positive in what has been a rapid period of time to react to something that none of us have ever seen before.
Thanks, Mark. So a strong theme there around having to explain the role we played, and perhaps not enough understanding at the local and national level on what that role was. And perhaps Juan Luis, you might want to comment on that as well, because you were you're in with operations in both Brazil and Peru. How has it been for you in those countries, and what have you learned? Can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is keeping well in the middle of this pandemic. I think it's been very, very challenging and interesting times for the industry. I would like to first perhaps highlight the importance of having a real and very strong, solid foundation over a common purpose and a fundamental shared value in the industry, Tom, which is our people, the safety of our people first, right? Even despite the financial implications of making tough and difficult decisions, as shutting down some operations, for instance, we believe those were the right decisions to be made, given that it was the only way to early on mitigate the health risk for our people while we were implementing the COVID-specific protocols. Our commitment to health and safety as one of the core values has driven all of our decisions since the pandemic started. We have walked our talk and prioritized at every moment the well-being of our people and of our communities, as Mark was alluding to. I think this has also highlighted the strength and importance of our health and safety management systems as an industry. We were certainly better prepared than any other industry, and this allowed us to very quickly implement the required protocols. And this ultimately resulted in the mining industry having a stronger performance than any other industry in these countries. Secondly, I really believe that this pandemic has allowed the industry to highlight and strengthen its role as a catalyst for social development in the areas where we operate. And I think Mark really alluded to this at the beginning. We work in very remote and rural communities where the government is basically not present. And I think the role of the mining industry in assisting these communities and protecting their people from the COVID has been fundamental. It has really reinforced the role that we play as an industry, having a very strong capacity to positively impact and create shared value in the areas where we operate. I think that as well as an industry, it has demonstrated the importance and effectiveness of articulating initiatives through our industry associations, much more than ever before, and in order to deliver real support and impact, right? Like donating through the mining chamber, medical tests, equipment, oxygen plants, etc., like never before. And this has certainly created a very significant impact. I think that third, this situation has pushed us to the limit in breaking many operational paradigms, forcing us to become much more flexible and efficient, truly thinking out of the box and relearning to keep our business running. The migration to working remotely or from home, not only on administrative or support functions, but also in technical activities, has been really remarkable. The capacity to adapt our organization, changing the operating model, and migrating into an agile type of structure, redeploying resources according to the new requirements and priorities of the business in the pandemic, has also been remarkable. And as a result, I believe the mining industry has been the first to resume its activities in Peru and Brazil, and is currently operating at almost the pre-COVID levels. This has required a significant change in culture, where we're going basically against the human nature, especially in Latin America, where we want to be close of each other, very close to each other. Changing that by implementing social distancing and the enforcement of protocols has been a very significant challenge in terms of a cultural change. Changing a culture requires sometimes years. In this case, it was only a few weeks. Last, and maybe not least, I think that through this pandemic, we have really confirmed the importance of the government's role, and specifically of having consistent, effective, and clear regulations as a key enabler of our ability as an industry to help navigate this crisis in the countries where we operate. In other words, our ability to positively influence the results and how to deal with the pandemic is directly related to the government regulation. Over-regulation can be a deterrent and can strongly impact the capacity that we have to help and support the local communities and the country as a whole. Clear government direction is essential to be able to articulate a timely industry-wide response to emergencies as the one that we have been able to put together. So government regulation has also been very important.
Thank you, Juan Luis. Some very common themes there to what Mark said. Tanya, does any of that echo in Australia? And perhaps you could give us an overview of how the sector has responded in Australia and what you've learned from it.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. And look, and hello to everybody around the world this evening, this morning, and today. I think that I can agree with a lot of what Mark and what Louis have said in their statements so far. For us in Australia, it's been really a story of cooperation and collaboration. Our first case in Australia was identified, I think, on the 25th of January, and it spread very quickly across the nation, and it led to governments shutting down what were considered non-essential industries. A lot of our retail, our accommodation, tourism, fitness industries closed very quickly. So we needed to act very, very quickly, and with the recognition that the mining industry is, it had a really critical role to play, both in keeping our workforce safe, the families and communities very safe, but also contributing economically and socially in remote and regional communities. So we needed to make sure that government recognised that the mining industry was really essential to the economy continuing through the pandemic, knowing that we didn't know really how long it was going to last. We only had knowledge of what was going on at an international level. So with that in mind, the MCA, working very closely with the coordinating with the state mining chambers, noting we're a federated economy, so we have states and territories, and at a national level we have our overarching government. We moved pretty quickly to develop resources industry protocols. We did that in partnership with the oil and gas industry and our state chambers. So it wasn't the only thing that we needed to do. Well, we were confident that we had the right processes because health and safety is foremost to our industry, as already been noted. We needed to convince government that our protocols would be able to see our industries through this pandemic stage. So we had to work with what was occurring in each of the states. There was a chief medical officer at a national level and at a state level providing advice to those governments and to a national government. And then there was a national coordination commission set up, a national coordination mechanism, and we had our own resources ministers. So we were tapping into governments at all levels, working with the partners that I've identified, and we needed to make sure that industry continued to lead. So ours was a mining industry-led recovery. Our board was engaged the whole way along. We had board members participating, driving working groups. We had a people movement group to make sure we could have FIFO workers working across across boundaries. We had supply arrangement issues, again, to move critical supplies across borders, and very importantly, communities and an Indigenous task force to provide the support that was needed to those communities. So this really worked well for us, and I think the industry moved very fast to meet all of the state regulatory constraints that were there, and also moving the workforces across states and locating those workforces within states so that we didn't get caught out by what were quite strict quarantine conditions. So there were changes to roster patterns, there were site-specific management plans that were needed, there were tailored arrangements for workers in remote communities in how they dealt with Indigenous communities, and new, as Mark mentioned, new processes to deliver essential services, water, power. So mobilising everyone to cooperate and to collaborate really has been the key to our success, and would be one of the first things that would need to be done if we were to see something like this in the future.
So I can imagine you talk about mobilising, and underlying that is a very strong focus on communication. And I think I'm muted now. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah. And I think that probably applies to all three of you. I'd like to come back to the community question. Mark, you did touch briefly on this, but Anglo is known for her investing and having invested a lot of time and effort over the years in social performance management and community engagement. It would be interesting just to hear in a few words from you how that has served you, and what you learnt in terms of the engagement with communities.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. First, if I could just say that fully support Tanya and Yois in terms of their observations. In terms of Anglo American, for those that know our history, we had a lot to do with excuse me, some of the development of improvements around HIV many years back in South Africa in particular, and we were the first company, I understand, that provided antiretrovirals to employees and families. And that health infrastructure that we had, certainly given the success we've had in containing that pandemic, served us well and has helped guide our early work on the health side. So we were very active in the community, and we learned very early that if you can work with your employees in their processes and their understandings, and it goes both ways, you can take that into the local communities and actually help develop the understanding at a very practical level in those communities, which then helps keep the community safe. And the principle that we developed around that was we need to keep our communities safe for the businesses to operate. It has to go both ways, because we're all coming from the same place. Everyone goes home every night in some cases. In some cases, we've got different accommodation. So getting that principle across in our business was really important. And what we then did is we've suggested to both the regional governments and federal governments, if you've got major businesses associated, it doesn't have to be mining, associated with major communities, our ability as a major business to procure protective equipment and a whole range of other things that average community members can't get hold of is absolutely key to helping the community improve its safety. The other side of that was, and I use a survey, we did surveys in the communities and trying to understand what people were most worried about and trying to understand what they saw as the way of protecting themselves. And 35% of respondents in South Africa said it was God that would help them get through. The cue for us was to contact our local churches and say, how can we engage with you and your constituents and help provide what we can provide to keep them safe. So that's where the food parcels and a whole range of other things that we hadn't have thought of ourselves started to come into play. So engaging with all of the key community constituents, and it ranges. But the role of business in helping communities keep themselves safe is this, because we can bring all this stuff in and we've got the supply chains, we can actually accelerate and help communities improve their defences and at the same time provide them sanitizer and a whole range of processes, PPE. And I think that engagement, and both Jan-Louise and Tanya made the point about cooperation, and it goes much further than we would normally see in normal circumstances. And when that starts to work, and I'd say it took around 2 or 3 weeks for people to start trusting each other in a very different type of discourse and conversation. But now people say to us, we feel safer coming to work than we do in our home situation because we've still got to go out and buy food. We've still got to expose ourselves to people we don't know. And that's natural. We're all in the same place. But if they've got a structure to work with, they've got guidance they can use, they can help their fellow community members, then from our point of view, it starts to create a critical mass of people behaving consistently and trying to help keep each other safe. And I think businesses beyond mining can play that role. And I think that's been a real big learning, and certainly something where we've been able to help, and getting the right gear to the right people in those communities been key.
Thanks, Mark. Juan Luis, have you seen the same kind of delivery? And while you answer, maybe you can answer one of the questions that has come in on the chat, which says that mining companies are using the pandemic as an opportunity to whitewash their records and present themselves as public-minded saviors. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on that. I think you're on mute again.
Sorry about that. I think the pandemic really evidenced the interdependence and the integration of our activities with the local communities since the outset. And we realized this very quickly as an opportunity to kind of change the narrative and the dynamic between the mining companies and the communities through a very direct engagement since the very beginning, and changing in a way the way we interact and relate with the local communities. Mainly because, unfortunately, in the past, the relationship had been more focused on the personal leadership of the local authorities and leaders of the communities, sometimes even looking after their own interests instead of looking after the common well-being of the communities. By having like this common enemy, which is the COVID, we all focused on one single purpose, which is how do we together fight this battle, on a stronger way and in a better way. So this opened up an opportunity for a more constructive, and I would say more purposeful dialogue, right? And also an opportunity to start articulating much better the actions amongst all levels of government, no? This has allowed us to leapfrog projects that have been stalled for years. For instance, we had been in a small town close to one of our mining operations in Puno, in Peru, in Antauta. We have been trying to set up a new healthcare facility for 3 or 4 years without success, mainly because the government will stop it. In 1 month, it was done. 1 month, the best healthcare facility in the whole area. Okay, and that's just an example of how this has changed the narrative and the dynamic. And it's a great opportunity. It has really allowed us to create very strong goodwill and alignment of interests. Finally, we believe we're all aligned. And of course, this has allowed us to extend our protocols, right, to the communities. We have a full integration where we now have, we realized very early on that healthy operations require healthy communities, right? And so we have all the protocols in place exactly as the ones that we have in our operations in all the communities. And again, going back to the cultural change, we have been able to create awareness and educate people on the importance of enforcing these protocols to protect themselves and protect the community. We have been able to, through this change of dynamic and narrative, improve significantly the health infrastructure, provide medical supplies, medical equipment, health professionals, everywhere where the mining industry operates, we have a much better performance and a much higher standard in terms of how to deal with the COVID. So I think it is, and it has become an opportunity, as the question rightfully implied.
Okay, thank you. Tanya, any response to the whitewashing comment in terms of support to the communities, and perhaps you might also like to talk specifically to how the industry has engaged with Indigenous communities in that context?
Well, I suppose I'll start with, a statement that people have been dying all around the world, and Australia has had our fair share of people dying in Australia, our most vulnerable, aged. It hasn't just been the aged, but we were deeply concerned about the most vulnerable, including Indigenous people in Australia, people that we work with every day that are neighbours to our mining communities. So, government made it very clear that it would be our most vulnerable that needed to be protected in communities. So, with our Indigenous people, and we have, we're the highest employer of Indigenous people in Australia in mining. A lot of our mining workers went home to their communities, and we needed to make sure that the approach that we took was not a saviour approach with Indigenous people and governments depending on the mining industry. It needed to be a community-led approach that Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous peak organisations needed to be the communities that led their own, their own approach to the pandemic. So it was community-led, and we needed to make sure that we shared a common goal to keep people safe, and that we had Indigenous people as our long-term partners post-COVID. So that was the approach that was taken. And importantly, at a national level, we had our National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, NACCHO, working with health organisation in a chairing partnership to lead that Indigenous response. So when the government put into place Commonwealth Biosecurity Act to remove access to remote communities, the mining industry's job was to make sure that we listened to what their needs were, supported in providing food security, communication, all of the water supplies, the food supplies, getting people, communicating in and out of communities. While we couldn't have that face-to-face discussion, we were listening to make sure that we were meeting their needs along the way. So we maintained that over a long period of time. We set up within the mining industry our own mining Indigenous task force within the groups that I mentioned earlier. There were weekly meetings to think about and talk about what the needs, how we would react to the needs that we were hearing about. We made sure that we developed a package of tools and resources to support the industry's response to the communities. And importantly, every single mining company stepped up and did what their own communities needed at a local level, whether it was supporting them through providing food, providing supplies, making sure that the companies enabled that communication to occur at a remote community level. So the responses were very different based on those local needs. So again, it was a strong partnership led by Indigenous people, engagement with them transparently and regularly, although it wasn't face-to-face there was that deep connection that was, was there to support the communities rather than act as the saviours for those communities.
Okay, good. That sounds like a balanced perspective and the right way to go. I'd like to turn now to the future, and maybe in looking at the future, we can answer one of the questions that has popped up a few times on the screen from attendees, which is how has COVID accelerated change, and what is the future workforce going to look like? So, Mark, any thoughts on that, and more generally, what the future holds for us given this pandemic? You're on mute, I think.
You're right. Tom, I think in many ways COVID will support an acceleration of change. And maybe if I make one point reflecting on the previous question, for the last 5 years as Anglo, we report every 6 months our safety statistics, our health statistics, our environmental statistics, and we're building our social plan so that we'll start reporting those as well. And you'll see that across all of those statistics, we've improved somewhere between 70 and 80%. So we're the first to acknowledge that we're still a works in progress. We're not down to zero on those measures, but gee, we're getting close, and we've still got a way to go, and we still have incidents we don't want to have, but we're getting better. In terms of what we do, we ask that we be judged on our actions, and therefore you should look at all of our performance improvements. And our response to COVID is simply about trying to do things better. And that doesn't mean we've done it as well as we could have. And at some point, we hope that people will recognise that the effort and the work that's going in across the board is helping improve the performance of our industry and certainly the way we present ourselves to our community. So our view is that COVID and the issues around COVID certainly heightens the sensitivity to community, to ESG issues, and the pace of change that I just talked to needs to continue to accelerate. And again, I'm actually quite comfortable people saying, you guys haven't got it right because you've made this mistake. And what I would say is, well, we've come a long way. We're not there yet, and we're going to keep driving forward. And we hope that people can be balanced in the way they look at it and say, okay, they're improving, but they need to improve quicker. I think that will come out of COVID. I think whether you're talking climate change, whether you're talking circular economy, more and more people are now starting to understand that if we eliminate the use of thermal coal, and that's a good thing in terms of carbon make and those sorts of issues, and that's a longer term objective, and we certainly committed to that with our carbon neutral targets. But you're going to need more copper, more nickel, and a whole range of other mined products to utilise the sun or hydropower or renewable power. We need different types of minerals. And the mining industry has a critical role to play in how communities and how society transforms for the future. And so when people say the mining industry literally produces all of the goods and products that we actually need to survive. How do we do it better? That's the real question. I think it'll speed up the social sensitivity to what we do and how we do things. And I think that's absolutely critical. And for a company, and as Jan Louise was scratching out earlier, for a company that rebuilt its whole purpose in 2017, and every time we make a decision, we check and test whether we're living those values of reimagining mining to improve people's lives, whether we can say that on a broad basis is something that we want to be held to account to. But we do hope that people recognise it's a journey. We're getting better, but we've still got a long way to go, and we want to get there quicker.
Juan Luis, are you aligned with that? Anything that you would add to that in the context of Peru and Brazil?
Well, I think I'm completely aligned with what Mark said. We certainly we see this as a great opportunity for the mining industry coming out of the pandemic, Tom. And I can think of this as an opportunity in 4 dimensions, right? The first one is that I think we're changing the way we work, and through the pandemic, we will have a much more resilient and efficient industry. Accelerating digital transformation we will require a change in the skills of our people. And we believe that this agile or lean organization is here to stay in the industry. The second dimension, and I think we have talked a lot about it today, is that this is an opportunity to really change the way we interact with the communities, set a new tone, a new dynamic with the communities, and a great opportunity to really gain a lot of credibility through the demonstration of the power of working together, right? Creating well-being and social value together. The third dimension, I think, is the relationship that we have with the government at all levels. I think the pandemic has really evidenced that the capacity that we have as an industry to basically catalyze, to become a catalyst for development is very, very big, especially in underdeveloped countries, right? So this is a real opportunity to enhance the articulation between the private and the public sector to create a much stronger response to crises like the one we're facing. I think it has also highlighted very significantly the role that mining has as a key industry to reactivate the economy post-COVID. You know, the economic crisis coming out of the pandemic is probably the strongest we've had in more than a century worldwide. And mining, especially in countries like Peru and Brazil, is a key industry to contribute to this reactivation. So there's a huge opportunity there to working together with the government to promote the development of mining projects that are in the pipeline. I really have to emphasize the importance of mining and promoting the development of new projects in order to be able to contribute to the post-COVID world, right? We have projects like Tía María in Peru. Of course, we have Quellaveco, we have Mina Justa. We have many projects that are in construction right now that have to be completed, but we have many projects that are ready to go, like Tía María, for instance. I think the time has come. I think the time has come, and this is the right moment and the opportunity. And last but not least, and there was a question around this, I think this is a great opportunity to really change the perception and the image of our industry. We have been able to really create significant real impact supporting the pandemic throughout the areas where we operate. We have evidence that our health and safety performance is better than other industries, and this is now recognized by the population. And we have been able to create a positive perception around the contributions that we have made to the pandemic, becoming this a building block to reconstruct the image of the industry going forward, in my view. We have earned that right, and we have basically demonstrated the capacity again to create shared value. I think that going forward, this is a great opportunity to be really recognized for what we are, you know, a key driver of sustainable development in the countries where we conduct our activities.
Tanya, anything to add to that? And in particular, since you're the head of a national association, are you starting to think about how to be even better prepared for the next time around?
Well, I think in short, yes, is the answer to that, Tom. But I think it's important to note that we're really still in the midst of the pandemic, and we've got a second wave sweeping through Australia and of course, Melbourne, we've got a city lockdown at the moment, and we're starting to see cases pop up now in New South Wales, which, you know, we're quite concerned about what might happen over the next few weeks. But, you know, I think that we are starting to see more and more pandemics, and we may see even a new strain creeping in over the next couple of years if you listen to what's happening at a global level with the World Health Organization. But I think that this pandemic has really highlighted that the mining industry is not just good at providing economically in countries like Australia. 58% of exports, 240,000 direct jobs, 1.1 million across the value chain. So that's 1 in 10 Australians in this industry. But we are incredibly good, and it's recognised at a community level and at a government level that we have led the way. The mining industry is held up as the industry that is cutting edge. It has led in the way that we have addressed this pandemic. And we've led because we are good at health and safety. We're good at communities and working with regional communities. And really that has meant that we've been able to get ahead of the game quickly. But importantly, it's that moving fast and being flexible has made all of the difference. And we will need to maintain that sort of agility for the future. And we're already talking to government and providing them with the lessons that we're seeing so far in how we have developed those networks and relationships, quickly tapping into that government thinking, and that's being used for other industries. So the lessons for us are, and the lessons at an economy, a whole of economy level, have been to make sure that we've taken, that approach of health and safety and applied that across the economy as a whole. So I think that that's really, our starting point for the future, and how we might address another pandemic if it was to happen again.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. We're almost out of time, but there's a nice closing question here, and I'll maybe just ask all three of you to give us your closing thoughts, and then I think we'll sign off. So the question is, obviously this pandemic has been a horrendous crisis for all of us. But if you had to pick what is the best thing that would have come out of this crisis, what would you highlight? Maybe start with you, Mark, in a few words.
I think, thanks, Tom. I would think that the relationship and relationships that we've built across a much broader spectrum of community as we've worked to find solutions to these issues has been the most positive. I think it's a learning both ways. One thing that people don't appreciate, and I'm on the board of Power of Nutrition, is in all likelihood, the greater tragedy of this pandemic will obviously be, one, the lives lost, those directly impacted, but a far greater impact and a greater loss of lives is likely to come as a consequence of the nutrition and what's impacted in countries like, or continents, Africa, India itself, in terms of the unintended consequences in other parts of the world, with a loss due to nutrition issues, the fact that aid to many of the countries around the world have been cut because of people's need to react to this, is actually far greater in loss. So we need to understand both. So I think the important thing is, one, we're working better together and probably off a lower base than any of us would like to admit, but I think it's certainly been a significant improvement. And secondly, how other things are connected. And from here, I think we've got to do a lot more foundation work to improve nutrition type issues as well. And that's something we're already thinking about as a group.
Okay, good. That's a good summary. Juan Luis, anything to add?
Yeah, pretty much on the same lines as Mark, but focus on reshaping the relationships with our communities and the governments, and really being able to become the key driver of the post-pandemic reactivation of the country, and really creating shared value with the communities. I think that's the best is going to be coming out of this pandemic is in a way a relaunch of the importance that the mining industry has on a much broader role than just, producing sustainable minerals for the world.
Thanks, Tanya, the last word goes to you.
Well, the power of a whole industry working cooperatively together meant that we had a few cases of COVID, but not very many. We lost no lives, and we made sure that our communities were well supported. So in terms of how you might act as an industry when times get tough and you're in crisis, I think that's the power of a whole industry working together quickly was demonstrated at its very best in Australia.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to all three of you for participating in this panel, a fascinating discussion. I think we could have gone on for much longer, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I'd like to also thank everyone who called in to this event, and we will now draw the session to a close. Thank you once again. Thank you.